Government leaders will soon be in Dubai for one of the UN's marquee climate change negotiations, the annual Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or COP28. Today, to help prepare for COP28 and better guide our clients with regard to how it may impact their business, my partner Ingrid York and I are here with Dr. Mahmoud Mohieldin, the UN climate change high-level champion from COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. Since the Paris Agreement, high-level champions like Dr. Mohieldin have helped realize climate change mitigation ambition and bring together the government and the private sector in achieving climate goals. Dr. Mohieldin is also an executive director with the International Monetary Fund and has held several senior positions with the Egyptian government, most recently as Minister of Investment. We are going to talk with Dr. Mohieldin about the impact and credibility of the COP, polarization and possible outcomes and expectations for COP28, loss and damage, financing the energy transition, carbon credits, the global stocktake, and technology development and transfer. So let's start with the geopolitical context that we're in leading up to COP28. Dr. Mohieldin, could you share your views on how larger issues surrounding the US, Russia, Ukraine, China in particular, are impacting expectations for what may be achieved at COP28 and possible outcomes?
I've been conducting our business on climate development, what's so-called the global public goods, in the worst of environments, which have been described by different people, but I like to quote here the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, when he was talking about the deficit in trust. And I like to add, if we had a deficit in trust, we have a surplus in crises. Adequately, we're talking about polycrises, permacrisis. But it seems that we need really to go on with business despite all of these kind of geopolitical tensions. And perhaps the climate action and the climate discussions are more of unifiers than otherwise. And we have seen that during the preparations of Glasgow. And at the time, again, the political environment was not the best, but we're suffering from a crisis, which is about the pandemic that postponed the whole summit for a year. Then when we're preparing for COP27 in Egypt, we had the implications of the COVID crisis, but of course we had the Ukraine crisis as well, the war in the Ukraine. And then we have a variety of crises. We have the implications of all of that, and then we have tensions at the global level and at the regional level with a catastrophe that's not very far from where we're going to be hosting our meetings. We have a very substantive agenda waiting for us for COP28. There is a very big list of answers to the big items that you listed in the introduction.
The recognition that the global stocktake is going to show and has already shown that the world is behind on achieving the goals that it set out in the Paris Agreement. So I think it would be helpful if you could share your views on successful examples of how government and private sector are coming together, including at events like MENA Climate Week, to enhance ambition, particularly in light of the recognition that the global stocktake is identifying gaps.
There are different ways in looking at the GST. One is basically to have it like an archival reference, which I think is not really what we're after here, because the emphasis, especially by the non-state actors that I coordinated and still doing that in support of the COP28. After COP27, I work very closely with Razan al-Mubarak, the climate champion from the UAE. What we need from this is basically a practical, forward-looking kind of document that can guide us, not just to 2050, because you lose audience and attention if you talk beyond a certain amount of years. If we can make the focus from now until 2025, and definitely we focus on 2030. And the good thing is that many of the programs, including in adaptation, in mitigation, are basically eyeing this kind of a year for finishing what they should really be doing. Here, the issues are as follows. We know what we should really be doing, and I take it in 3 lines of defense or attack against the climate change as a war. So the first line of defense had been very much compromised, which is mitigation. We're not doing what we should be doing, and the emissions are still high, and instead of reducing the emissions, we're increasing them. We know that we need to reduce them by 42-43% from now until 2030. What is happening is that we're adding to them in practice by 14-16%. So are deviating from target by roughly 60%. If we to believe the what's so-called the NDCs, or the nationally determined contributions by countries, we're not going to be on target. We are going only to reduce the emissions by 2%. So even the ambitious, or what should be ambitious, documents like the NDCs of different countries are not ambitious enough. And the practice is worse than that. So what we hope from COP28 is really to bring the evidence into the dynamics of action by governments and by the private sector. The second line of defense is adaptation. And adaptation was very much vague and opaque, unlike mitigation, because we know what we should really be doing in decarbonization, in investing in renewable energy, in solar, wind farms, and now the strong arrival of green hydrogen could be a game changer as well. But adaptation, people would just say adaptation. But that was not really being taken seriously. And I, as a person coming from finance background, I like to see if that is reflected in the actions or not. If not very far from here, my past employer, the World Bank, the share of finance of adaptation to the total finance is roughly between 15% to 20%. Sharm el-Sheikh is remembered for the loss and damage, the establishment of the fund of loss and damage, but it did more in the adaptation front, which is basically about the identification of public-private partnerships in different areas of adaptation, from food systems to agriculture, to water management, to resilient cities, to dealing with deforestation, desertification. So here, when you started to put some light on the different opportunities, you will start to get the private sector interested. Instead of their contribution today of 2 to 3% of total, they could be improving. And now with the MDBs like the World Bank or the African Development Bank, they would start to get more demand from governments to do better in this area of work. So this is the second line of defense. And the third is the loss and damage. And until recently, there was an interesting debate, and people were very concerned, including at the last meeting they had in Aswan last month. And then they met in Abu Dhabi for 48 hours with a pressure on them to finish. And we learned from the history of many COPs before that these are events of last-minute agreement.
Yes.
So the last-minute agreement happened, and now we have one. 3 areas of work, because it's not final until it's final. What's coming from the transition committee are just recommendations. So what we're expecting is we hope to endure these recommendations, and the areas of focus will be, again, this will be open for discussion. I think issues related to hosting of the fund are going to be open, but hopefully to be blessed now, especially with a sunset clause on the World Bank to be the temporary host, which is a good idea, not because I like the staff there and they are my friends, but with the experience, compare that to an alternative like what happened to the Green Climate Fund. It was a good idea, but until it was established, you have a host and get the staff and agree on the governance and all of that, it took years. So at least with the World Bank, it could really be operational next day. But for that to happen, you need the money. And here we need to see some dollar sign attached to the fund. And then, of course, you need to finalize or agree on the recommendations on who should be the beneficiaries. So these are the 3 lines of defense.
Just talking about the provisional agreement, two particular areas we wanted to drill down on, the financial instruments that will be used by the fund. Obviously they mentioned grants and also concessional lending. I would be interested in your thoughts on that and whether you think there's other tools that may be available for the fund, and also allocation of the fund.
Well, I'm coming with the experience of almost finishing the replenishment of the Green Climate Fund. So I was tasked to do this. And it's a tough environment. Of the 30 countries expected to contribute, 26 of them now contributed, which is great, or pledged to contribute. But that was not easy. There is a process. It's not enough to get a word of support from a minister. There is a parliamentary process. And then there are issues about budget constraints, and the political dynamics in some countries are not as supportive to multilateralism or to the global public goods as it used to be in the past. But we did well so far, and I'm saying so far because I'm still having great hope that we can really get some good announcements before the COP or during the COP from the 4 remaining countries, the US, Italy, Switzerland, and Sweden, on the expectations on some of the traditional or conventional contributors, on the role of new and emerging contributors on voluntary basis. And of course, the pushback is basically that there are rules of CBDR, which is the common but differentiated responsibility. And this had been very much one of the main pillars of the Paris Agreement. And there are the issues of the historical responsibilities as well. But that from time to time is being challenged by the advanced economies. I don't like to turn it to be global south against global north, but I think there will be in the future some changes in the dynamics of funding, because the current model of financing development, climate action is not sustainable. And we need to push hard to make sure that we have adequate resources. And these resources coming in concessional terms are very much essential to support the role of the private sector, because they are expecting de-risking and enhancement of their opportunities through partnerships. For the loss and damage fund, of course, there is a kind of very sensitive use of the terms. We're not talking about compensation. There is an issue here that some countries in particular are concerned about any use of that term. But it's more about support, solidarity, mitigation of whatever happened. It's a kind of support to the communities impacted and the economies impacted. But even with these words, you need the funds. And what I see now, that perhaps on the mitigation front, with the exception of higher risk countries, you can rely more and more on the private sector. There is a business case and the returns have been realized, and we can really get more of that. In adaptation, even after the Sharm el-Sheikh adaptation agenda, it's more of public-private partnership, but with a bigger weight on the public purse than the private sector in terms of contribution. But loss and damage, it should be coming from public sources given the nature. There could be a role of the private sector, especially the insurance sector, in assessing the risk, in assessing the damage, but not in the contribution.
In the loss and damage context, then, is your view that the strict adherence to the CBDR principle that separates the obligations of the historic emitters and early industrializers like the US and Western Europe from other states, that CBDR division is very important to maintain for financing loss and damage?
Yeah, and I think it was discussed, it was raised, it was challenged, and I think there is some agreement for now that we are going to be abiding by the old rules with the spirit and philosophy of the Paris Agreement. But here is basically whether this kind of agreement on text is going to be operationalized in the way that you will be seeing adequate funding in the fund. So this is a big issue about whether the fund is going to be with the kind of substantive resources that could be required. In the case of Pakistan, for instance, and that happened and we are very grateful to the government of Pakistan because they put their case very strongly to the participants. And of course, the many cases of the small islands, more vulnerable than others. But in the case of Pakistan, I think the estimates of damage were around $35 to $40 billion. What they received after the pledges and the appeals and the humanitarian calls for action didn't really get them more than 1% of what they asked for. So this is the kind of a matter here that it requires that you need to have this fund with adequate resources to respond for recovery and support of the affected communities as fast as possible. Having the institutional readiness to provide this kind of quick response is very much needed.
Just taking a step back and chatting about just and equitable transition finance, could you maybe let us know a little bit about your expectations for COP in respect of that, and maybe which sectors you think will be in scope for that, and potentially which financial instruments or other tools might be employed for that, and what might come out of COP on that topic?
I think the presidency of the COP have put a very nice and super ambitious agenda for action, and we have seen some good announcement as well from the presidency of COP28 in Kenya. The $4.5 billion of support to the African continent, $3.5 billion is going to be on private equity participation and finance for the just energy transition and adaptation as well. And $1 billion, which is very critical, for catalytic support, capacity development, technical assistance. And this is very smart because I had this interesting discussion with Mark Carney after the launching of GFANZ, and I chair GFANZ Africa. So we started with an argument on his interesting piece on the country platforms, whether we have a pipeline of bankable projects or not. I said, well, as a former Minister of Investment, I can assure you that there is a pipeline of investable projects as well, not just bankable. So he has the money, the 130 trillion plus. And then we, during the last couple of years, we have been working hard with the regional economic commissions of the UN, with consultancy firms, with private sector investment banks. And now we have, just for demonstration, more than 400 projects shovel-ready, and many of them beyond feasibility. They are already in business with returns, but they are after scaling up and replication elsewhere. And we started to get some good investments in them. What is missing in some cases, not the promise of the money and not the pipeline of bankable projects, is basically some issues related to governance, rule of law, contractual arrangements. Otherwise, we managed to bring the supply of funds to the potential demand of them. But for that to be really business like development, we need the catalytic support. So for the global partnership, it will be more of what we saw in the case of Africa and the platform that's being created. The gap for developing economies and emerging markets is $2.4 trillion. This is excluding China, assuming that China can take care of herself in that matter. 1.4 trillion will be coming from domestic markets. So if you're going to be putting some attention on some action, it's going to be not just for foreign investments, but for domestic investments. It's not just about the budget. Because in the past, people would say domestic resource mobilization, this means budget and reallocation of budgets. Yes, this is happening, but there is a great deal of emphasis on the role of the domestic private sector. And then we have the 1 trillion, $500 billion coming from private sector, 300 from the multilateral development banks, and 200 billion from the bilateral sources. So here, any amount of money that could really be considered, including the famous $100 billion of Copenhagen, or any kind of contribution, which definitely will be welcome from the UAE, needs really to be put in that context that is going to be contributing to bridging a very big gap.
So what do you think good government intervention or regulation looks like then?
I have a great deal of respect to a recent Nobel Prize winner, Esther Duflo, who's made a great deal of work on matters related to poverty through the MIT labs. And she said, actually, she may have summarized in 3 seconds what we're talking about. You need climate action, not compromising poverty. You need to do the following: adequate finance, technology, including R&D and capacity development, and your question, incentives. So incentives are carrots and sticks. Some countries are better in the sticks. Some countries are better in the carrots. But actually, for the third party, between the carrots and sticks of Europe and the US, some developing countries are between a rock and a hard place there. Because you may survive the IRA, which is an incentive to do good, and then you get yourself into the trouble of CBAM, which is an incentive to lower the harm. I'm not expecting for any legislator in any country to go and have a survey on the international public opinion. But I would say a consideration of spillover while you are drafting these kind of laws is very much warranted, because the recovery from that is always going to be taking time and hard to fix.
Do you have a view on what progress will be made with respect to Article 6 at COP, and specifically perhaps a mechanism under Article 6.4?
Compliance markets are harder to establish in developing economies and emerging markets for many institutional, legal, and capacity development requirements. But until that happens, let's do the seemingly easier one, which is the voluntary kind of markets. I'm happy that during the discussion that we had in Africa, in Addis last year, we're discussing the pipeline of investable projects. And while we had the discussion, 2 things came. One, and both related to finance. One is basically about the potential of voluntary carbon markets in Africa. And we had an initiative, which is called ACME, the African Carbon Market Initiative, that has Rockefeller Foundation behind it, USAID, of course, the Regional Economic Commission of Africa, and many partners from the private sector. And GFANZ Africa is there as well to support it. Being in a developing economy doesn't mean a second-rate kind of standard. It should be abiding by the international standards, because the demand and supply needs to really become from international markets dynamics, not exclusive there. The second thing is basically about disclosure, integrity, and governance. So this again about standards. For this example from Africa, and I'm aware of many initiatives, including from the UAE, from Riyadh, from Egypt, in establishing their own carbon markets and linking it one way or another to some more established or older markets. And there was actually a great deal of collaboration. I remember talking to my Chinese friends. They said that the EU was very much helpful in establishing their markets. We got some offers of help from the London Stock Exchange recently as well for the African one. So this is an area of collaboration.
And last question on carbon. Obviously, we're seeing various states develop their own standard, as you mentioned. So this gives rise potentially to the issue that we have a lack of standardization across various states.
Yes.
What do you think we can do under Article 6 to avoid that, whether it's, more work under 6.4 or something like that, to avoid that sort of fragmentation that might happen as the states develop their standards?
There are a great deal of lessons, especially on the investments under the green color, and people are questioning what color is green, and the greenwashing and the greenwishing and all of that kind of. If there are lessons learned, I think when we're establishing the markets, we need to put them with the clarity on the standards, and those who are going to verify the application of the standards, the capacity development to regulators and supervisors, and the good education and the literacy that is required to the market participants. And here we're not talking just about the big players. In the case of the African market, there could be a potential in the adaptation front, in the forests, for farming as well, and all of the related activities. So we need really to invest more in this area. I see no alternative, but again, partnership and twinning with the more advanced markets in this area.
You raised some important points about the key outcomes from Sharm el-Sheikh, and you spoke about the loss and damage mechanism, adaptation and mitigation financing. Do you have expectations or predictions or hopes for key outcomes that we could see that could gain the same level of fanfare that those key outcomes from COP27 gained?
What makes the news makes the news. And loss and damage adaptation agenda made the news last year. The work on the partnership with the private sector as well, building on Glasgow, on the coalitions, made the news with opportunities, especially with the partnerships for JETP. You remember the announcements for Indonesia and Vietnam, and after the announcements in Glasgow as well for South Africa. Senegal came recently during the Paris summit as an opportunity for partnership. But there could be some things that may not really make the news, but they need the emphasis. If there is major contribution that we are building on now from Sharm el-Sheikh, is that kind of false dichotomy between climate action, sustainability at large, and development. Because people, especially for developing economies and emerging markets, they would always raise the question, climate action is only for few countries, for the elite. What's in it for us? But if you manage to put climate action in the center, not by overdoing it, because it's naturally the case. We have 800 million people without access to electricity. If you are telling them that there are opportunities in public-private partnership that can make electricity access affordable and clean, when we're talking or preparing for COP27 last year, we had a food crisis because of the war in the Ukraine, and we had as well the challenges because of the increase in interest rates on debt. So again, if the Sharm el-Sheikh adaptation agenda is about food, water, agriculture, the nexus between food, water, and energy, if Sharm el-Sheikh was successful in bringing the development agenda and the immediate needs for dealing with issues like food security, energy access, and better finance than relying on debt, actually 86% of funding for developing economies on climate action is debt dependent. And the majority of such debt is not even concessional. So the public-private partnership platform that are going to be created, and we started to see how that is going to be shaped and the opportunities on mitigation and on adaptation, that could be a great thing that we need really to push and build on. And could be operationalizing some of the old pledges, the 100 billion, and put it in the context of de-risking. And the GFAN's announcements of the $130 trillion to mobilize the financial sector, the asset managers and owners behind opportunities in the field, especially in developing economies and emerging markets. Sharm el-Sheikh brought climate action close to development, what COP28 is trying to do, bringing nature and biodiversity close to the whole agenda. So I think you are seeing this issue of the old siloed approach is being challenged. If silos are basically about having a community of practice, specialization, great, congratulations, do more of that. But at times, because we're talking about system-wide approaches, get these silos connected and get the expertise and specialized people working together. So now we have the development group, or the SDGs group, that has this symbol on that pin. And we have the climate action team. In the past, you talk to the Climate Action Club, they only talk about $100 billion, as if there is nothing else. And then when you realize, well, 100, congratulations, you got your 100 billion. What are you going to be doing with the rest of the funds of the 2.5 trillion, which is the very conservative estimate on finance? So here we are providing these solutions. Again, development, climate, and then you get nature and biodiversity and the opportunities of partnership and the good work of science and support of finance. Of course, you would expect some work on technology, especially in decarbonization, carbon capture, more investments in R&D. That will really be there as well. And I'm happy that the Science and Technology Day, there are going to be lots of good practical discussions about role of science and technology in this area as well.
Any other thoughts on the impact of COP28 on our clients, whether it's their future planning or business, to bring it back to what we were chatting about at the beginning? I know we've touched on so many topics today, but any final thoughts on why they should be really focused on COP28 and the outcomes?
So I think great deal of opportunities for deals to be made, contracts to be signed, and for safeguards to be put in place. And there is an opportunity as well for technical and consultancy for capacity development. The second, that when it comes to the possible harm, there are opportunities as well for those who are trying to defend those who could be impacted by the harm. We mentioned a few of them, and to put the case strongly. And then there are issues I think there will be evolving as we are discussing them, like the operationalization of the integrity rules. You may have seen the recommendation of Minister McKenna and her team about the matters related to claims and pledges by the private sector for net zero, and whether it is being met by action or there are question marks about that. So there is a great deal of operationalization in this issue to minimize greenwashing and to bring credibility to the system. And again, there is a great deal of work and opportunities there. So I think having this COP28, first in Egypt with its focus on the substance and development, was a game changer that's being felt. And I was happy that through discussion with Excellency Sultan Al-Jaber and his colleagues, including today, actually, Ambassador Maged Al-Swedi, who has a very important role in this COP, that the cumulative and incremental increase and building on the previous COPs that he's focusing on as president of the COP, Sultan Al-Jaber and his colleagues. Adaptation, you need, people say double adaptation finance, others say, for good reason, quadruple it. Renewables, we need to scale it up a minimum of 3 times of what we're doing today. Dealing with deforestation, the kind of efforts, it needs to be doubled. So this is basically, if we are putting the matter in a kind of a race against time, we might really be doing better, because some people say keep 1.5 degrees alive, which is the right thing to do. This is the recommendation of scientists. But actually some of the regions in the world, including some parts of the Arab world and some parts of the Horn of Africa and the Sahel, are already above the world average. And that's why we see what we're imagining, that these are problems for the end of the century. It's becoming problems of the end of the day or end of the week of some people, and they are exposed to. So urgency and putting finance, technology, and good incentives at the scale and the good support is basically what we require now.
Thank you so much for your time today. We're very, very grateful for your attention, and it was a pleasure talking to you. There was so much there for us, and we wish you all the best with your important work and also with COP28.
Thank you so much, and looking forward to seeing you in Dubai.